Hello and welcome to Joe and Kat Chats. Today we're talking about virtue signaling, faux activism, and as always, some happenings around the world. What's going on? We're recording today live on May 11th, 2021 on Facebook and YouTube at /JoeNiceDJ. Find us on all socials at Joe and Kat Chats and on our personal pages at JoeNiceDJ and at CatWells22. We are also happy to be a part of Tastemakers Radio on the Dash Radio app. Listen every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Pacific and 2 p.m. Eastern. And as usual, I'm very excited to get into our topic today. But first, how are you, Joe?
You know what, Miss Wells? I'm as good as I'm going to be. I'm good as I'm going to be. There are a couple of things I want to talk about and make sure I mention before we start the proceedings today. As you can see, I am wearing a keffiyeh. Today is World Keffiyeh Day. I am wearing the typical black and white keffiyeh in support of our Palestinian brothers and sisters. We are going to discuss that entire situation later today in some more detail as in advance of today's show. In addition, as you can see on my shirt, these are some Hebrew letters. For those of you that might be watching, you can't see it. Those Hebrew letters mean Free Palestine. As we've said before, and we will continue to say on this show, we must stand with the most marginalized communities. We will continue to stand with the most marginalized around the world, whether it is our precious brothers and sisters in Palestine, whether it's Black people in the United States and Canada, whether it is Indigenous peoples in Canada, United States, and other parts of South America, whether it is the Rohingya in Myanmar, whether it's the Uyghurs in China, whomever, wherever, whenever, we will continue to do so because that is what this show is about. We are most interested in making sure that people around the world maintain their statuses of humanity, freedom, equality, and survival. This is clearly I cannot be in Palestine right now because of travel restrictions, etc. But if I could, I would be there right now, standing alongside of them, because what is happening is an injustice and an affront on not only international law, but human rights law. We've talked about that in 2 episodes of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And for the historians out there, please make sure to review and rewatch and rewind both of those episodes because it is important. Today is also May 11th. On this date, 40 years ago, one of the greatest musicians of all time, and we talked about this musician on the Black Men and Music episode during Black History Month about 2.5 to 3 months ago. Robert Nesta Marley died on this day exactly 40 years ago. And we've talked about his music in great detail. The world deserved old man Bob Marley. I'm going to make sure I say that again. The world deserved old man Bob Marley. We needed old man Bob Marley with gray dreadlocks. That's what we needed. We needed him talking about everything that is happening right now in the world, because so much of his music that he wrote 50 to 60 years ago spoke to everything that is happening right now around the world. When you talk about songs like Concrete Jungle, there's a line in that song where he says, "No chains around my feet, but I'm not free. I know I'm bound here in captivity." Think about what is happening in Palestine right now, where they are not chained. There's no chains around any of their feet, but they're not free. That is why I'm wearing that shirt, Free Palestine. They are stuck they are bound there in captivity. They can't go anywhere. The Gaza Strip is an open prison. If you learn, go ahead, there's plenty of information about what is happening there. We talked about when I gave that speech at the People's Power Assembly last June. I closed out that speech with a Bob Marley lyric where I said, "Get up, stand up for your rights. Get up, stand up, don't give up the fight." Think about how important and prescient those lyrics are now more than ever, when we are continually having to fight for humanity, freedom, equality, and survival around the world. Again, around the world. There is another song that I want to make sure I begin to read some of the lyrics to. It's a song called Revolution. And in that song, it says, "Never make a politician grant you a favor. They will always want to control you forever. Revolution. Think about what this is. Bob Marley talking about this almost 50 years ago. He's singing about this. He says, it takes a revolution to make a solution. Too much confusion, so much frustration. I don't want to live in the park. Can't trust no shadows after dark. So, my friend, I wish that you could see, like a bird in the tree, the prisoners must be free. Think about when we talk about defunding the police, the prisoners must be free. Think about how many prisoners, how many people are behind bars because of nonviolent drug offenses. Think about how many people are behind bars because of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's drug policies that locked up generations of Black and brown people for minor drug infractions and use and or possession of marijuana. The prisoners must be set free. Bob Marley spoke about this. Bob Marley talked about this. Let's not forget, when we talked about Bob Marley, we talked about the colorism episode. Most people think that Bob Marley is Black. Bob Marley is actually biracial. He is biracial. He was born to an 18-year-old mother, a Jamaican woman named Cedella Booker, and a Scottish quartermaster, the captain in the Navy named Norval Marley. Cedella Booker was 18. Norval Marley was the ripe old age of 59 years old. 59 years old. Robert Nesta Marley was biracial. He died on this date 40 years ago of cancer. We could spend an entire episode or two just speaking about Bob Marley, but we have a whole lot more that we need to discuss in today's episode. But I would be remiss if I did not mention Robert Nesta Marley, because his legacy and his life lives on in his music now more than ever. And it is important that we remember not only those lyrics from those three songs, but other songs. Songs. Three little birds woke up this morning, smiled with the rising sun. Three little birds are by my doorstep, singing sweet songs of melodies pure and true. This is my message to you. Don't worry about a thing, because every little thing's gonna be all right. And now more than ever, there are days when we wake up and we're just like, what the hell am I doing? What am I supposed to be doing? What is my purpose in life? What is my meaning? What is my raison d'etre? How do I find that joie de vivre? Where do I find it? What is it?
Parlez français.
Exactly. What is it? And now more than ever, we deep down in our hearts, that hope that we have inside of all of us is going to lead us to say every little thing is going to be all right.
It has to be. Yeah. I mean, that's what keeps us going as activists, as social justice advocates, for sure. I will just point out quickly, we did talk about Bob Marley in you mentioned it earlier, but we did a two-part episode. In one of those episodes about Black people in music, which was in February. So I guess, I don't know, you can look it up. And if you want to know more about the carceral system and cannabis and or drug use and imprisonment and racism, along with all sorts of other drugs. We did an episode on 420 of this year with a special guest. So please check that out as well.
Absolutely. How are you?
I'm okay. I mean, when you spoke about how, we all sort of wake up some days and just have to remember everything's going to be all right. I had a moment the other day where I heard the news about Palestine. I mean, when I say that, I mean, I heard about the protests going on, and I mean, every day since that, there has been more news that is generally just tragic for those who are Palestinian in the occupied territory of Israel. So I wanted to talk about that with you today, because I mean, obviously we're on the same page. We want to free Palestine, even though, like you said, there's no shackles on their feet, but they are being occupied, and this is a big and complex issue that a lot of people don't want to talk about. A lot of people who are activists don't want to talk about it because it is such a complex and it has such a deep history, and there's all sorts of things that are involved in the history, which I mean, I don't know if we have time to get into, but at least for this episode, I wanted to kind of go over what the situation happening over the last like 5-ish days has been.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So the Sheikh Jarrah situation, Sheikh Jarrah is a neighborhood that's in the occupied East Jerusalem, which legally, according to international law, belongs to Palestine. So the illegal Israeli settlements are taking over this land. So basically settlers, Israeli settlers enter land and don't leave. So what happens is they're pushing Palestinian families out of their homes, and then the Israeli soldiers forcibly remove those families if they refuse to leave from their own land. So what's happening is the Israeli courts have now ruled that 6 Palestinian families in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood have to leave their homes in May, and then they've also ruled that an additional 7 have to leave in August. And the appeals that these families are conducting are likely going to allow for these Israeli settlers to steal their land and their houses, their homes, their belongings, because this has already happened before. The judicial system in Israel just favors the Israeli occupation of land because they're Israeli people running the judicial system. So what happened in response to this is it's now May. Hundreds of Palestinians have been protesting in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, trying to protect these 6 families that are being removed this month. And so the Israeli police / soldiers, which are notoriously brutal, are inciting violence. They're spraying skunk water, which is a mixture of chemicals with sewage water, and violently arresting Palestinians. Now, 2 days ago, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is a sacred and holy site in occupied East Jerusalem, was attacked by Israeli soldiers when worshippers were praying on site. And it was a retaliation for the protests happening in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. Now, last night, there were also Israeli airstrikes in Gaza, which Gaza has been blockaded once again, where there's ongoing blockades in this area where no one can get in or out, which means no medical supplies, no food, no building supplies. It's not good, particularly during a pandemic. Anyway, so last night there were 21 people killed, Palestinians, and 15 of those were children. Now, I just want to end this sort of information with the fact that this is not just some isolated thing across the world, because the United States of America gives $3.8 billion, and Canada gives approximately $85 million in aid to Israel each year, which does what? Oh, it bolsters their military. The US also sells them tons of weapons. It also, this money emboldens the Israeli administration, which operates on systemic racism, settler colonialism, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, theft and occupation of land, through intensive military presence, murder of Palestinians. And one thing I will note, just in regard to the attacks that happened last night in Gaza, I just wanted to, I guess, point out to folks that 40% of the Palestinian population is under 14 years old. While the people that are at least 65 years old account for only 2.9% of the population. 2.9% of the population. So what that means is the occupation of Palestine has been happening for, I don't know, I guess just over 50 years. And so because of how the military operates in Israel, they've basically murdered adults in Palestine. So, I mean, the population being 40% children, there's reasons for that, and that's a really extremely high percentage of your population being children, and a lot of this is because of violence in the Gaza Strip. So anyway, that's sort of an overview of what's going on. I just feel like we need to be talking about this because we're talking about we're talking about faux activism, we're talking about virtue signaling. And for me, if you're an activist, or you're trying to be sort of a social justice advocate, like, we all learned at different paces. I'm not vilifying you, but if you're not talking about this issue, then that's telling something. That's telling to me that maybe your activism is a little performative. Maybe it's, something Joe Nice DJ has coined, a term called woke theatrics.
Wow.
So
Yeah, Ms. Wells, thank you for sharing all of that. That's important and spot on. I'm firmly in lockstep and agreement with everything you just said. Additionally, we had a couple of episodes devoted to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And one of the articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is Article 17. Article 17 states that you have the right to your own belongings. You have the right to own your own things or to share them, and no one can take away your property without good reason. Think about what the Israeli Defense Forces are doing right now in that particular neighborhood of East Jerusalem. They're taking people's property without any good reason, just by, to use a political term, by fiat, just because they feel like doing it. That's clearly a violation of human rights. We talked about the vaccination process that's taking place in Palestine in a previous episode, and how there's international law stating that if you are an occupying country and you occupy a particular piece of land, you are responsible for the medical care of those people in that occupied land. And as of right now, people in Palestine and the Gaza Strip have received far fewer amounts of vaccines than the people of Israel. And Israel is completely open right now. So there's been, I think they have reached either herd immunity or something even greater than herd immunity. A vast majority of people in Israel have are fully vaccinated. So everything is open in Israel. But when we're talking about Palestine with respect to the vaccine, that is clearly not the case. In addition to specifically in the Gaza Strip, these areas are highly overpopulated. There are places in Gaza Strip and in Palestine that only receive electricity 3 or 4 hours a day. There are places in those areas where they are not allowed to receive any sort of medical care. In order to receive any sort of medical care, you have to have a specific permit granted by the Israeli government. And in many instances, in plenty of instances, those permits are not granted. And when we talk about human rights, we talked about Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, stating that everybody has the right to personal care. This includes housing, clothing, food, and of course, health care. So again, we've discussed how right now the not only international legal rights of the Palestinian people are being violated, but specifically their human rights are being violated. And at this point, this has gone on for far too long. And this needs to be more than just countries saying, hey, Israel, please stop doing this.
Yeah,
please stop.
Agreed.
This needs to be more than just that. Because I'm old enough, and I'm going to sound like an old man, but I'll bring it up and I'll say it because it's important. I vividly remember years ago when South Africa was in the midst of apartheid, and countries around the world banded together and said, hey, South Africa, it is time you stop persecuting Black South Africans. We will boycott, we will divest, and we will sanction you until you change.
Mm-hmm.
This is the sort of activity that must begin to take place in Israel in order for this sort of human rights violation to cease. This is wrong across the board. And this, what befuddles and baffles me to this day is if you call out and speak out about the situation in Palestine, you all of a sudden labeled as anti-Semitic, which is not true at all. Because you can be critical of what is happening in Israel and what is happening to the Palestinian people, and not be insulting towards other Israelis. It is wrong to say it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense to have that situation take place. So again, what is happening right now in Palestine, again, is an affront on not only international law, but human rights. Something must be done. There is that military defense system that's over Jerusalem, I think Jerusalem, called Iron Dome, and the United States military paid for that. That is a United States military situation. And you spoke again about how Canada funds Israel and how the United States for over the next 10 years will be paying $3.8 billion each year for the next 10 years. Bear in mind, there's a whole bunch of people in the United States that still don't have health care. $3.8 billion could go towards some of that. $3.8 billion could go towards building homes. $3.8 billion could go to potentially stimulus money, even though it's not much, but it's still money. It's still money, and it's taxpayer dollars. So again, when we talk about what we're talking about today, virtue signaling, faux activism, it is important that we make sure that we understand what the issues are, understand how to articulate what is happening with a clear and concise message. And it is also important that we make sure that we have all of the information. And if in fact that we don't have all the information, we can go back and make corrections. Because because we're not perfect, but there's been plenty of people who have researched these situations, who have reported in the Gaza Strip and in Palestine and in East Jerusalem to see what is going on and what is happening. And it is our responsibility, based upon what we do here with this podcast, to make sure that we speak about this, and again, to continue to support the most marginalized wherever they are, in any place and in any space.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's worth noting that, like, we're human. I appreciate you saying that, because like we do make mistakes. That's a thing. And even today, like I feel like I'm underprepared because I feel like I wanted to do more research to ground my understanding and I guess perspective on these issues, on these topics that we're talking about. And just to clarify even further with the Israeli-Palestine circumstance, like, this is absolutely a criticism of the Israeli government and of their illegal occupation of Palestinian land.
Correct.
This is not a criticism of, religion necessarily, of the human beings that live, that are identify and are proud Israelis. I mean, I've met a few Israeli folks in my day, like, not a criticism to them. They're wonderful people, just like you're a wonderful person and I'm a wonderful person. So yeah, I mean, people tend to get really emotional when we talk about this particular situation, because it is complex and there's no way that we would be able to actually do it justice just with one episode. So I do encourage everyone to go in and look into this issue themselves, because it's complex, it's full of nuance, and I just want to be really clear there that this this is just a little tiny piece of what's going on, in the last few days.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I'm happy we were able to have a clear conversation about this. There are plenty of magnificent Jewish people that I know. In fact, one of my very good friends is in Tel Aviv right now, and we had a conversation about this situation yesterday over a bunch of messages on Instagram. I would love to eventually get one of my friends who lives in Tel Aviv to kind of talk about this a bit more. That's a possibility. Maybe that's a future episode for the greatest podcast in the history of podcasts, Joe and Kat Chats. Anything could happen. But I know we are 26 minutes into today's episode, and we haven't even discussed what we wanted to discuss yet. So we have a lot to talk about, Miss Wells.
We do. Yeah. I think in true form, we should probably define some terms because a lot of this stuff is sort of thrown about in this sort of online these online spaces that we occupy, a lot of us, because the pandemic is ongoing and we're seeing the world through our online lenses.
Absolutely. But before we start, there's I'm reminded of another Bob Marley lyric, and it's from the song Satisfy My Soul. And in that song, Bob Marley says, "When I meet you around the corner, you make me feel like a sweepstakes winner." And I'm saying that directed specifically to you, Miss Wells, because I feel like a sweepstakes winner right now. I honestly do. And I can't imagine anyone else that I would rather spend 60 minutes doing this podcast and sharing this space than with you. So I feel like a sweepstakes winner right now. And I'm hoping when the listeners and the viewers who are watching and or listening to this either now or on a replay feel the same way, because we are 48 episodes in. Next month we'll be celebrating exactly 1 year of Joe and Kat Chats, which is hard to believe. And it's been a magnificent ride, and I'm looking forward to whatever year 2 has to offer.
Oh my gosh, thank you for saying that, and I feel the same way. This has been, it's always a pleasure to get together on Tuesdays to record, and it's been just wonderful. So thank you.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. And as you so eloquently said earlier on, we like to do definitions because we're academics to a certain extent, and we like to make sure that we can break things down and dissect and absorb, so everybody gets these morsels of information in digestible pieces, so they can understand what's happening. So, by all means, give us the first set of words, please.
All right. So, activism. It's a policy or action of using vigorous campaigning to bring about political or social change. I identify as an activist myself.
Interesting. Now, when we talk about social change, that social change can also be economic. It can also be environmental. And for those that want to learn about the environment, you can go back and listen to a previous episode of Joe and Kat Chats where we discussed the environment. We also discussed politics in the voting episode, which I think was episode number 20 of the Joe and Kat Chat series. And we've talked about social change and economic change on various episodes, both reparations episodes. We've talked about the whiteness episode, if I'm not mistaken. We've talked about that on several episodes.
Oh, for sure.
And we've also talked about, activism usually comes in the form of a protest. And we've talked about protests. That was episode number 2 of the Joe and Kat Chat series.
Yeah.
And we talked about the various types of protests that you can have: protest, march, rally, vigil, strike, wildcat strike, picket line, etc. There's loads of them. Go back and rewind it. You can watch the tape. We discussed it. And in that episode, in that protest episode, I defined what a protest is. I said a protest is a marketing plan for a grievance. I'm going to say that again because sometimes I talk fast. A protest is a marketing plan for a grievance. Protest is a marketing plan for a grievance. Yes, Ms. Wells, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Which is a mechanism that activism or activists use to campaign and push for that change that we're just talking about.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. Now, you have people who show up to protests or show up to rallies or vigils or demonstrations or sit-ins or work slowdowns or work shutdowns or strikes or picket lines, etc. And they try to have these sorts of activities that show that they're a good person, that the public will look at and say, you know, yeah, he's a good guy. Yeah, she's good at this. It's called virtue signaling. Virtue signaling happens when you, an individual, tries to show that you're a good person by sharing opinions or thoughts that the public will think is a good idea, or that they'll say, hey, you know what? Yeah, that's great. We like that. Sometimes virtue signaling can also be called moral grandstanding. And we've seen this in plenty of instances. Take, for instance, Colin Kaepernick. Now, his taking a knee, him and Eric Reed taking a knee, was an actual example of a silent protest for Black lives, and as a result of police brutality against Black people in the United States. Now, plenty of other organizations decided to, quote unquote, jump on the bandwagon and take a knee, knowing full well that many of these organizations didn't actually give a shit about anything Colin Kaepernick was doing or anything with regards to substantially improving the lives of Black people in the United States. Take a look at what McDonald's was doing. Take a look at what the NBA did, painting Black Lives Matter on the basketball court. Take a look at what the National Football League did after they colluded against Colin Kaepernick, and then decided, hey, you know what, we should have actually listened to Colin Kaepernick later on. Take a look at Nike. And then when you have corporations that do this type of corporate virtue signaling, there's an actual specific term for it. It's called woke washing.
Okay.
Woke washing. And I know by the way you said, oh, okay, that you probably have never heard that term.
I've never heard it, but it makes total sense.
It makes total sense because, look, you know, this is what we do here on Joe and Cat Chats. We give out the information. We share it. We give it up. We share. And there are plenty of people who will take a knee in support of Black lives, but are still racist as hell.
Oh yeah.
Or they're not doing anything substantial, or at least trying to understand issues involving white fragility so they can better understand the systems of indoctrinated racism and genocide that are in the United States and Canada and other countries. So that is virtue signaling.
Yeah, so another term that sort of gets thrown around that's really similar is called performative activism, which is a form of activism used to increase one's social capital or personal gain rather than genuine support towards a movement, issue, or cause.
True.
And so I feel like these two things are really, really similar in the sense that, I mean, corporations can do this, personal, like individuals can do this. Often it happens when, you know, you have a following of some kind, you being the corporation or the person, and you're using that to sort of gain more popularity or momentum within a certain space in order to basically virtue signal that you're woke and you're a good person,
right,
when you don't necessarily have the action that's going to be backing that up. Now, woke is another word that is thrown around a lot. Do you have a definition for that, Joe?
Yeah, but I wanted to go ahead and a little bit more with performative activism on that, because there's a bit more I wanted to add on top of that, a little bit of salt and pepper that I want to put on that. Now, sometimes you'll hear the term slacktivism. Slacktivism and performative activism, it's the same thing. Same thing. Yeah. And you also hear a term that I came up with literally off the top of my head about this time last year when I said woke theatrics.
Yeah.
Woke theatrics. Same thing. And there are plenty of examples of woke theatrics or slacktivism or performative activism. We talked about this earlier this year. Actually last summer. Remember how many people put black squares on their Instagram?
Yeah.
How many people did that? Whenever there is any sort of political unrest or there is a natural disaster that takes place, and people will go ahead and put flag filters on their Facebook pages.
Mm-hmm.
We saw this with the earthquake in Haiti.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go ahead and put a filter on my Facebook profile. Okay, but do you understand why Haiti is the most economically downtrodden nation in the Western Hemisphere? And why they're still catching hell to this day? But putting a flag filter on your Facebook page is all of a sudden going to help you understand what's happening there. That's not the case. There are plenty of people that put when the Cathedral of Notre Dame burnt down in April of 2019, a whole bunch of people went ahead and put France Facebook filters on their Facebook profiles, and that's a tough sentence to say, but that's what happened. But not really understanding how all of the colonialism that took place with direct respect to France. And let's not forget, as of the date of this recording, May 11th, May 10 was the commemoration of France ending slavery in France. And that was commemorated yesterday in Paris. And the French Prime Minister Emmanuel Macron went ahead and had a ceremony. But there was nothing in that ceremony about offering any types of reparations for the dozens of countries that were colonized by France. Nothing. That commemorative activity that the French presidents did yesterday is a perfect example of performative activism. Because if he actually cared about the Francophone countries that his country colonized 2 and or 3 centuries ago, there would be cutting checks to every single one of those countries and taking all of the necessary steps to indemnify those nations that France has taken resources and, in many instances, lives from. And we all understand that the most important resource in the world is a human life. And France is responsible for taking millions of those lives. So again, when we talk about performative activism, and we talk about being quote unquote woke. We don't care about ceremonies. We care about activity. We care about action.
Yeah. I just want to just clarify here, and I think you'll appreciate this, Joe, in the sense that, I mean, these terms are thrown around a lot, particularly in the online spaces I occupy as an activist myself. And so I want to just clarify that example you used, where Macron is, hosting these events and whatever, that's a lot more of a woke theatrical moment or a virtue signaling moment than it is a performative activism, because he has power. He's the leader of a country. He's not an activist.
Well said.
So
well said. You know what? And I stand corrected, and thank you for the correction. I thoroughly agree. And he does have power. He can do something about this.
Exactly.
He can do something. There's a reason why every weekend, and we've discussed this ad nauseum, why there's a whole bunch of French people in the streets wearing yellow vests and black vests. Why there were 100,000 people on Sunday in France protesting for environmental protections and environmental rights. Emmanuel Macron can do something about this, but he chooses not to.
Exactly. Which is a lot more of a virtual, these ceremonies, stating that, you're woke. It's theatrical. It's a virtue signal because of how our culture and our social, I guess the social capital, is exchanged now, because that's changing. So exactly. but there's no action to back it up, which is exactly why you used it as an example, because it's a perfect example of the topic we're talking about today.
Exactly. And I said the word woke. Woke is awareness of social justice and racial justice. And in the instance of, quite honestly, many of our country's leaders, we talked about Emmanuel Macron. We can certainly speak about Joe Biden. We can certainly talk about Justin Trudeau. These people are what's called fake woke, meaning they understand the issue. They understand what is happening. They have the political power to make the substantive changes that are needed, but they choose not to. They pretend to care about a social or racial injustice and or issue, but choose to do nothing about it. Take a look at the instance of Joe Biden. Again, and I've spoken about this. You can look at the video that I was involved in about 2.5 weeks ago on the Status Quo YouTube channel, where I spoke about Joe Biden and how the Omnibus Crime Bill of 1994 is the reason why generations of Black and brown people were put into prison, why the prison population quadrupled, while the Omnibus Crime Bill also reestablished the federal death penalty, and it also criminalized non-payment of child support. That was Joe Biden. If Joe Biden actually wanted to do something about that, I'm sure he could have. Now he's the president of the United States. I'm sure he could repeal the 1994 Omnibus Crime Bill. He could also do something about the Crack Bill of 1988, the Civil Asset Forfeiture Law of 1984, the Rave Act of 1993. He has the political power and capital to make substantive changes in these United States, and he is refusing to do so. He's refusing to do so. He can eliminate student loan debt with a stroke of a pen. He could give everybody health care with his signature on a piece of paper, but he's choosing not to do that. Again, woke theatrics, performative activism, virtue signaling. Look at your prime minister, and I'm sure you could speak ad nauseum to the fraud that Justin Trudeau is.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, Justin Trudeau was criticized and I don't know what the word, I'm blanking, but like applauded, I guess, for both of those things for being a feminist when he first came onto the political stage of Canada a few years ago. And, you know, he's notably created his administration that was 50% women. And he, you know, when asked about that, he said, oh, well, that's just the way it should be for whatever year it was. Yet at the same time, where's his, you know, feminism when it comes to the missing and murdered Indigenous women that are constantly, you know, those numbers are constantly rising. This is a real issue. Where's your feminism now, Trudeau?
Well said.
But
well said. Well
he's
said.
a racist, so, you know.
Bear in mind, this is the same gentleman who in college was caught at a fraternity party in blackface.
Yeah. There was more than one instance.
Right, and then said he didn't know. He didn't know it was offensive.
Yeah.
And by the way, that's the leader of your country, Miss Wells.
He has the power to change a lot of things in this country, but he's choosing not to. But he certainly is virtue signaling when he calls himself a feminist, and he is, you know, using the word woke and whatever, which I will just say, I mean, woke is a term that comes from AAVE, which is African American Vernacular English.
Correct.
And so this term, I mean, comes from a place that it needs to be, we need to recognize, because it's in people's vernacular in the broader population now, and it's becoming, I think the word is being cheapened by a lot of this like left versus right rhetoric as well. So
I agree.
To keep in mind.
I agree. And when we talk about left versus right, there's a mechanism that we've discussed on this show several times. It's called the Overton window. The Overton window, where the Overton window is a range of acceptable policies to the mainstream body politic at a particular or specific time. Now, one of the things that you and I have made a conscious effort of is to try to get away from using these two particular words, Democrat and Republican. Because when you specifically use Democrat and Republican, it instantly cheapens the nuance of political conversation that must be had, census regarding political differences. And we've talked about, and I've mentioned this on the live and direct chats, the best way to try to resolve conflict is to have, number one, have conversations with people that you don't agree with or don't normally speak to. Figure out what you can agree on. Figure out what you can agree on. Make sure that what you then at that point, popularize what you can agree on, then mainstream the popularization of what you can agree on with policy.
Yes.
That's the 4-step process. I've talked about it on some of my other videos on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/JoeNiceDJ. Scroll through, the information is there. Me and Miss Wells are here for each of you. But with respect to the Overton window, we want to get away from Democrat and Republican, or in your instance, conservative and Green Party, or NDP,
Liberal.
or liberal.
That's sort of the equivalent of Democrat and Republican.
Exactly. Exactly. Now, with the Overton window, you have this imaginary window, and within this imaginary window is what is generally accepted policy. Now, the further away from that window of acceptable policy, the further to the left you go, it is understood that you have more personal freedoms as an individual. The further to the right that you move away from the window, it is understood that you have less freedom as an individual. And that sort of spectrum is where we get the term left and right from, or left wing, right wing. Yeah. Now, there are degrees or within this spectrum as you get further away from the Overton window. You go from popular to sensible to, it's okay, it's acceptable, then radical, and this could be left or right, and then just off the charts, like there's no way, unthinkable, there's no way this could actually happen. And the example that I consistently have brought up with respect to the Overton window is the 2016 presidential election in the United States. Because in the 2016 presidential election in the United States, the Overton window was completely shattered into pieces, because you had a left-wing candidate named Bernie Sanders saying, Medicare for all, free college tuition for everybody. In the 2012 election, that was politically outside of the realm of conversation, of public discourse. Nobody would have said that as a political candidate, because that would have been political career suicide.
Yeah.
That's on the left. On the right, the opposite was also true. You also had a presidential candidate that said, I'm going to build a wall and have Mexico pay for it. That same political candidate also said, I'm calling for the complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States. There's no way anybody would have said any of those statements publicly and or privately in 2008 or in 2012. In 2016, that was generally accepted political public discourse. The Overton window was completely smashed in the 2016 election, which is why the 2020 election was just as crazy as we all imagined it would be. So again, the Overton window is important to understand, because when we talk about the ability to communicate with people and communicate ideas and thoughts, and as we talked about earlier, we talked about communication in the health communication episode, and we talked about communication in the language episode. We said that communication is the transfer of meaning and understanding of meaning. And in that specific episode, I said that words have the power to hurt, words have the power to harm, words have the power to heal, words have the power to help. It is important that we understand what words that we're using and how we use them and how we can communicate with other people, so we can come to some sort of general consensus and or understanding.
Absolutely. I mean, thank you for outlining that again, because it's an important concept, and I think it really helps to sort of understand where these conversations need to be had, because we can understand, if we understand what's in the Overton window, as it shifts, we can kind of, figure out what we can speak about and what people will be able to really, I guess, understand, in the sense that like they'll want to advocate for it as well. Like a perfect example of this in myself is last year, when we sort of started all of these conversations, I hadn't really looked into abolition. And I mean, I just kind of was like, oh, okay, well, I mean, yeah, I don't like the police, and I understand that that is a problematic source, and I don't want the police anymore. But beyond that, I didn't really look into or understand the meaning of the greater movement for prison abolition and all of that, because I just kind of didn't think about prisons as like part of this huge system where, I mean, it's a huge system that we've set up to perpetuate ongoing police brutality. We're basically, I mean, with the 13th Amendment, we've created a system where slavery is ongoing in the United States through the prison system, which I encourage everyone to look into and listen to all of the Joe and Kat chats forever, because there's 48 episodes where we talk about like all of these issues. But yeah, it's just an interesting thing where I sort of got radicalized in this sense where I was like, oh, I'm not just advocating for, you know, defunding police, you know, because I agreed with that with the Black Lives Matter movement, but it goes much beyond that. And now I consider myself an abolitionist.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Absolutely. And again, when we talked about the prison industrial complex, there is a magnificent book that I think everybody should read. It is called The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. Read the book. If you don't necessarily want to find your eyes through the pages of a book and you want to watch something on your TV screen or on your phone or on your laptop, you can go on Netflix and watch a documentary called 13. It's a magnificent documentary, which was based on the book by Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow. And Ms. Wells, when you talk about being able to participate in movements and being able to communicate, so many times people, especially with the way people communicate now and social capital and social currency, when we talked about maybe 20 minutes ago, many people fall victims of something called cancel culture.
Mm-hmm.
Cancel culture. And that's basically when you get ostracized from social circles or professional circles. And it happens online, typically happens online. And in many instances, the person who gets quote unquote canceled never gets a chance to learn from their mistakes or apologize for what they did wrong. Now, I've referenced several previous episodes today, and another previous episode that I'm going to bring up is episode 28 of, again, the greatest podcast in the history of podcasts, Joe and Kat Chats. And in the health communication episode, I mentioned the 3 spheres of social interaction. And some of you might remember these if you were taking notes. And if you weren't, that's okay, because I'm here for each of you. Now, the 3 spheres of social interaction are personal. And the personal sphere of social interaction is are the people closest to you, your homeboys, your homegirls, your crew, your posse, if you will.
Yeah.
Your people. Your people. Or as my British friends would say, the man dem.
Nice.
All right? As my Australian friends would say, my blokes. Your people. Okay? There's your technical sphere of communication, which is communication with agreed upon standards. So if you're in court, there's a specific way you are communicate with people. Your Honor, I rest my case, etc. There's in government and or parliament, there are specific ways of communication. Many of those methods of communication, if there's a book that I had to read parts and bits of in graduate school the first time around called Robert's Rules of Order. It is a very dry and boring read, but it's an informative read. If you want to learn more about parliamentary procedure and or governmental procedure, it's a useful read. Please read it. And the third sphere of communication is public. And this is conversations like you and I are having about community and or global issues. And we do this every week. This is the public sphere. We're out here, and we're out here for the people. And you and I, given what we do on a week-to-week basis, we could easily be victims of cancel culture. Easily. At the same time, we had a public space that we're continuing to cultivate right now. And if in fact we do make a mistake or have a misstep, a foul up, a bloop, a bleep, or a blunder, we are willing to fall on our proverbial swords and correct whatever mistakes we need to correct. Yeah. So we understand this. At the same time, we also understand how to communicate with people, because we understand that communication is the transfer of meaning and understanding of meaning.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, all of that was so helpful and important. And I think, I mean, when we're talking about the communication, those like three kinds of communication, it just reminds me of sort of the way, you can utilize your social capital, which goes back to the definition of performative activism. It's in order to increase your social capital. And so in personal gain. And so like there are ways to use this communication to for good and for performative purposes. As far as cancel culture is concerned, though, I found a really interesting post, and it was by Marie Beecham on Instagram. You can go find if you like. But I'm paraphrasing the post because it was pretty long, but I just want to read it out because I found it really interesting. So cancel culture at best holds public figures or organizations accountable for shameful behavior. At its worst, it's a disorderly mob that shuns everyone who disagrees. In practice, it falls somewhere in between these extremes. So those who question what the dominant group, in whatever circumstances you're in, thinks, they are canceled for being bigoted, which can lead to anti-intellectualism. And that's her point, is cancel culture can lead to anti-intellectualism, which is when productive back and forth discussions, debates, questioning gets cut off and doesn't allow for differing perspectives or opinions. So here's a quote: "Society thrives when every reasonable viewpoint gets a seat at the table."
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Let me just say that again. Society thrives when every reasonable viewpoint gets a seat at the table. Mm-hmm. Now, cancel culture is the opposite of that. And so, I mean, it's just a discounting of someone's opinion, no matter what, if it differs from the dominant group.
Absolutely.
In whatever circumstance.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned that, Ms. Wells, because I know we're running short on time. We have about 2.5 minutes left. And I know that definition you just said with respect to making sure that everybody has a seat at the table, that's somewhat reminiscent of that definition of that quote from that one scholar, and I forget her name, with respect to diversity and inclusion, where diversity is while diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. Similar situation there. Similar situation. And I know we have a couple more definitions, but I know I wanted to kind of go back to the whole social interaction and the 3 definitions, because in the language episode, we talked about interpreting and making sure that we understand the context in which messages are being delivered. And I said there are 3 ways that you can interpret. You can interpret interlingually, interculturally, and intersemiotically. Go back and listen to the language episode, especially with respect to culture, cancel culture, woke theatrics, activism, etc. It is obviously important that you understand the language that somebody else is speaking, but it is also important to understand the culture in which the context and the precepts are being set for the conversation that is being had.
Yeah, absolutely. That is so important, especially when we're talking about, issues that are ongoing across the world that I personally have never been to Israel or Palestine, for example. This is something that we need to be careful about, but it's also important to be talking about, because it affects more than just the people who live in that region of the world.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's important to be talking about this stuff, because there is so much performance and there is so much virtue signaling going on right now. So it can sometimes be hard to decipher and hard to, have these conversations, because you think you're going to say something wrong. But
absolutely,
in this space, everyone, just so you know, you can't say anything necessarily wrong unless it's like real wrong. We will correct you, but we're not going to do it maliciously.
Exactly. One comment here: Tom Wallace, one of the greatest of all time, fellow Calvert Hall graduate, Baltimore, Maryland, checking in from, I think, Nairobi, Kenya, if I'm not mistaken. Thank you for always for the definitions and scene setting so helpful. Out to you, Tom. Thank you, brother. Miss Wells, we got to go.
We do. So thank you so much, Joe, as always. It's always
Very
a
welcome.
pleasure.
Pleasure's always mine.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. Take care.
Peace.